Welcome to Equip, Build, Mature. Hope you're having a great day. It's a beautiful day here. As I like to do on Saturdays, I want to do an overview of one of the books of the Bible. Today, we'll be looking at 1 Peter. The first of the 5 questions we ask when we're looking at a document is, who wrote the document? Well, the first word of this letter, Peter, identifies the author. He called himself, in chapter 1, verse 1, an apostle of Jesus Christ. He wrote this letter to Jesus' covenant disciples scattered throughout the northern areas of Asia Minor. He wrote to encourage these congregations of Jesus after the apostle Paul had been martyred. Peter wrote to Jesus' scattered congregations, including both Jews and Gentiles. Peter referred to the letter's recipients as exiles. You see this in chapter 1, verse 1. This word exiles indicates that Peter did not speak in terms of Jews and Gentiles. He spoke to Jesus' disciples that lived in such a way that would have stood out as foreigners among their surrounding cultures. So, what time in history is it? In his letter, Peter spoke a lot about persecution. He expected the persecution he and other disciples of Jesus would endure in the final years of Nero's reign. When Peter wrote, he had not yet been arrested. He was arrested and martyred around AD 66. In 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 13, Peter sent greetings from the local congregation in Babylon. That was a common metaphor for the city of Rome. And he used the name of the ancient Mesopotamian city to refer to the first century city of Rome. Rome of Peter's day, like Babylon, was immersed in idol worship and false gods. God's word does not say Peter was in Rome. But later tradition suggested that in Peter's final years, he taught Jesus' disciples at Rome. And based on many references to suffering and persecution, Peter probably wrote in AD 64. That was when the persecution against Jesus' covenant disciples was becoming much more focused under the Emperor Nero. So why is 1 Peter so important? Well, it focuses on the importance of Jesus' disciples living for spiritual significance as they endured extremely unjust suffering. We see this in chapter 1, verse 9, and in chapter 2, verse 20. 1 Peter could be called the New Testament's Job. He encouraged Jesus' faithful covenant disciples to keep living for spiritual significance, the way Jesus called his disciples to live. Peter called those covenant disciples to endure the same way that Job had endured. Job suffered, even though he was righteous in God's eyes. Peter taught that God expects this kind of perseverance from his covenant people who live for his significance rather than trying to find the significance that the world offers. So, what is the big idea in this letter? What is the major emphasis? Living in the presence of Jesus for more than 3 years gave Peter the best possible example of what it really looked like to live a holy life, a life set apart only for God, in the middle of a world that is hostile to the idea of God and the morality of God. More than any other man who walked the earth, Jesus exemplified living for significance instead of living for insignificance. And that is why Peter pointed his readers to the best example of that, which is Jesus. Peter challenged Jesus' disciples, he says, in chapter 3, verses 14 to 18, but he challenges them to live and act to please Jesus during our short time here on earth. he will say, in your hearts, regard Christ the Lord as holy. This included that we needed to submit to authorities, even when the authorities are extremely unjust or biased against us. In the government, we see this. In the home, we sometimes see this. And in the marketplace of ideas. Jesus must be our focal point for prioritizing our life in the middle of trials and troubles. By building our perseverance in the person of Jesus and in the work of Jesus, his covenant disciples can always hold tightly to hope in the middle of our suffering. So, how do we apply this to us? Unjust or unforeseen suffering is one of the greatest problems that imprison people's hearts today. We struggle with frustration, uncertainty, and anger when strange and unexpected trials enter our lives. And way too often, in those most difficult moments of life, confusion rules and our contentment evaporates. Questions increase as prayers tend to decrease. So how do we react when suffering comes? Well, many fall apart at the thought of more pain and more unjust trials and tribulations. If we live for the significance that is found only in Jesus, we will be able to stand firm and we will be able to stand strong no matter what comes into our lives. Peter encouraged Jesus' disciples that received this letter to persevere in their faith, to live only for his significance. It is not enough to simply get up every morning and slog through each day. It has no meaning to paste a smile on our faces and ignore troubles. The lesson of 1 Peter is that you and I have a reason to push through the troubles. We recognize that troubles are temporary in the eternal scheme of things, but walking in holiness and walking in hope as people of faith leads us to the life of true significance. And that's when we find our value, our worth, our identity, and our purpose. Thank you guys for sharing a few moments with me here today. Hope this has encouraged you or challenged you in some way. Thanks a lot. You guys take care.